Well, hello everybody, and today we're going to be looking at sampling. And sampling deals with the number of people that you use in your research. How do you know that the people you're using are adequate and proper for your study? And having said that, how do you know how many to use? So sampling is an important part of your research, whether you're doing an experiment or whether you're doing a survey or questionnaire or whatever. Sampling is an important part of all of that. So let's go ahead and get started today as we look at sampling. Okay, welcome back everybody, and today we're going to be looking at Chapter 16, which deals with sampling designs and sampling procedures. And really what we're looking at now is selecting the people who you want to examine or research. There are different ways that we can go about selecting. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the basic terms and methodologies in selecting a sample for your research. Now let's begin with some terms. First one we have is a population, or really what they mean is the universe, and that's any complete group of entities that share same common set of characteristics. For instance, let's say for instance I wanted to select Southern Baptist. So Southern Baptist would be my population group. That's the whole universe of Southern Baptist. But then we have population element, and that's any member of a population or individual member of a population. So that may be me, I'm a Southern Baptist, or any Southern Baptist within that population. That would be an element. Now a census is an investigation of all the individual elements that make up a population. Let's say for instance you wanted to take a look at, well, the census today goes out throughout the United States. So they're looking at U.S. citizens and all of the elements that make up U.S. citizens, from demographic information, age, race, socioeconomic status. All of those things can go in to the elements that make up a census. And then we have the sample, which is a subset or some part of a larger population. And we're going to take a look at samples here in just a second, but you can't really, let's say for instance, I wanted to do a census on, let's say the United States. I can't really feasibly do a study or research on everyone in the United States. So I can take a subset or some part of that larger population, which is the U.S., and study it, and that's what a sample is. Now, why use a sample? Well, there are budget and time constraints, and again, there's limited access to total population. Can you imagine how long it would take to poll every U.S. citizen? It would take a tremendous amount of time and a tremendous amount of money to do that. So we would normally just use a subset or a sample or a portion of the whole population. You get accurate and reliable results, and many say that it yields just as much accurate information as a census would. And destruction of test units. If we were to take test units like we do in normal research, we'd have to destroy, or we would never be able to use them again. Whenever, as your book indicates, whenever a test is done, let's say the effectiveness of a product, the products in that experiment are destroyed afterwards. So it's not feasible for us to take everybody and be able to study them, because we would not be able to go back and use them again. So sampling reduces the cost of research in finite populations. So we still have a body of people left even after we take the sample. Now the exhibit here talks about the stages in the selection of a sample, and really what we're looking at here is define the target population. Who is it that you want to poll, or who is it that you want to study, and who are the relevant individuals. If you're looking at employee satisfaction, your target population would be the employees of that company. Select a sampling frame, and that's a list of elements from which they may be drawn. And these are the working population people. So if I wanted to take all of the female workers at Federal Express, then that would be my frame. Determine if a probability or non-probability sampling method is to be chosen. Plan the procedure, determine the size, select the actual sampling units, and then conduct your field work. And we're going to talk about these here in just a minute. Now, defining the target population, I just mentioned that a minute ago. What is the relevant population? Who do you want to talk to? So what are those characteristics of the population that you want to study? Only those who meet that criteria should be used in your population group. The sampling frame. So it's a list of elements from which a sample may be drawn. It's also called the working population. So out of all the workers at Federal Express, you can draw from those that you want to work with. And these are the ones that you will use to study. Now, the textbook gives you some resources that you can use. Mailing list, if you want to take a look at, let's say here, let's choose one. Adoption agencies. And you wanted to do a study on adoption agencies, you can order mailing lists to these agencies. And here in the United States, there are 1,621 total count here in the U.S. So you can take a look at that, and these things are very handy. They are great tools when you can get a hold of them. There are companies that sell them, but know that they're expensive. They can cost quite a bit, but they are a quick way of being able to gather information about people that you want to study. Now, sampling services, they provide these lists that I just showed you. They can give you the name, address, phone numbers, email addresses of populations. You have a reverse directory, which is like a phone book, except that listings are by city and street address or by phone number rather than alphabetical by last name. So if you want to do a study on zip code, let's say Bartlett, Tennessee, and whatever that zip code is, you can get a directory for that. And then international research, its availability of sampling frames varies dramatically around the world. So depending on what you want to look at, in France, there may not be any adoption agencies, for instance. So it's going to vary depending on the region that you are wanting to conduct your research in. Now, a sampling unit is a single element or group of elements subject to selection in the sample. For instance, if we looked at, let's say Federal Express, and we wanted to look at airline pilots, primary sampling unit would be Federal Express, secondary would be airline pilots, and tertiary, unless you go to the third stage, or if you go to the third stage, it may be pilots with more than 10 years experience. So you're just using different levels or layers in that study and identifying them as such, as distinct layers within that study or that company. Now, there are errors that we can identify. First of all, you have a random sample error, and that's just something happened that varied the way in which you were able to select a sample of people. It's also the difference between the sample result and the result of a census conducted using identical procedures. So let's say I wanted to do a census on, let's say, the Mid-South, and I wanted to sample some people from the Mid-South, and I use the same procedures to be able to identify both, and if there's a difference, there's something wrong in the sampling. And then again, as you see here, there's a fluctuation, a statistical fluctuation because of the chance variations. Any and everything can happen when it comes to sampling. And if you do have errors that come up, that would be a random sampling error. Now, there are also systematic sampling errors. And here you see these are the errors that result from non-sampling factors, primarily the nature of the study's design and the correctness of execution and so forth. So as you see here, it's not due to chance fluctuation. There can be the nature of the study. You may be looking at areas or conditions that fluctuate. And that's the nature of the study's design. It's to do that. So you can have systematic sampling error through that. Probability sampling is a sampling technique in which every member of the population has a known non-zero probability of selection. That means everybody has a chance to be selected. And the probability is the same across the board. Non-probability sampling is a technique in which units of the sample are selected on the basis of personal judgment or convenience. So if I wanted to take a look at the pilots at Federal Express, I may not look at every pilot that's throughout the nation who works for Federal Express. I may just judge that the pilots here in Memphis should be a representative sample of that whole population group. And not everybody is going to have the chance because the people in Des Moines, Iowa didn't get the chance. So it's non-probability. And here it says the probability of any particular member of the population being chosen is unknown. Now, convenient sampling, you look at the ones that are most conveniently available. When I was doing my research, my sample consisted of those who were in mosques. That's who I contacted to try to get a list of names, and that was for convenience. I didn't go to every Muslim area in the South. I just went to mosques, and I went to the mosques to get the list of names. Judgment, which is purposive sampling. It's where an individual who's experienced selects the sample based on personal judgment about some appropriate characteristics of the sample member. So I chose people personally who I felt would be a good representation of the data that I was looking for. For instance, there were a lot of Muslim imams who are preachers or priests, and they wanted to cherry pick the people who I spoke to because they would put a glowing face on Islam. But I knew that that's what was going on, so I chose people who, once I started talking to these individuals, I asked them, who are some people that you know are also Muslims who converted from Christianity? So they were not expecting, or they were not trying to give me a propaganda list. They were just telling me of people who they knew who had done that, and those were the people that I used. Quota sampling ensures that various subgroups of a population will be represented on different characteristics. And your book talks about having a requirement for 100 interviews. And out of those interviews, I think 75 would have to be new students and 25 would have to be senior students, and it's up to the person to meet that quota. He or she would have to find that number of individuals for each area. Now, when it comes to non-probability sampling, also we have sources of bias. You can choose people because they're similar to the interviewer. You may like them. They may have that appeal. So you would have to be aware of that. And they're easily found. Mine were fairly easily found. And I guess I was biased in a way because I only looked at mosques. I didn't go into the community because really they wouldn't allow me to give them the time of day unless they knew that I was approved by their priest, willing to be interviewed. And there were several who I spoke to or tried to speak to who didn't want to be interviewed. So I had to forego that. Middle class, those are some issues that you have to deal with. Advantages of quota sampling. You can get the speed of data collection. You can get it quickly when you have a select number of people to get, and lower costs also, and convenience. Now, snowball sampling is what I did. And here's where the initial respondents are selected by probability methods, and additional respondents are obtained from information provided by the initial respondents. So again, what I would do, I would go in and I would speak to the clerics, and they would tell me, you need to speak to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. Well, that was really just to get my foot in the door or get an initial platform so that I could gain access to the people who I really wanted to talk to. Because sure enough, the ones that the clerics gave me were very anti-Christian and pro-Muslim, and they were going to give me the party line approach or responses. So I decided not to use them. But what I did do, I would go ahead and interview them, but I would ask them, now, do you know of anybody who is similar to you or has experienced, the same thing, who were once Christians but converted to Islam? And I mean, the floodwaters opened up. They weren't looking so much as trying to give me names of people who were going to be really spokesmen for Islam, but they were giving me plain folks who they knew who would speak to me. So that's snowballing. And then you go and do that as well with those that they gave you. When you talk to them, you ask them, do you know of anybody who has had a similar experience or has or who meets the same criteria that you do? And you can get more people and more people and more people, so it snowballs. This is what we used to do in recruiting. Whenever we would interview an applicant, we would always ask them for 3 people who were similar to them in grades and background and so forth. And that was a great way. We call them referrals. Who can you refer us to? And they would give us names, and it was a simple, quick, and effective way of being able to increase your sample list. And then we have here simple random sampling. And again, that's where everybody has an equal chance of being chosen. Systematic sampling is a starting point by a random process, and then every nth number on the list is selected. Let's say for every, you might want to interview the airline pilots of every 10th new hire that they brought in. So you might want to take a look, okay, well, we're going to do a random sample, and then we're starting with so-and-so, and then every 10th person from him, we're going to select for an interview. and then you have stratified sampling. And this is where you have a population, let's say retail stores, Academy Sports could be your population, but then you want to subgroup them by the amount of revenue each of those stores generate. So you could have the million-plus stores, the 500,000 to a million stores, and then 100,000 to 500,000 stores, and you can stratify it, which means just placing different levels again on those population groups. And essentially, these are the basics of sampling. Again, this is where you're going to get the people who are going to participate in that study. So you want to make sure it's unbiased, that everybody has a chance of being selected, and that if you do use judgment, that you're using it not based on your biases, but based on the ones who are actually qualified or best qualified to participate in that study. Well, today we were able to take a look at sampling and some of the fundamentals of sampling as far as how to do it, and also we looked at some of the biases that go along with sampling. And with anything, when you're taking a look at dealing with people, you can run into that issue of sampling bias and probability and non-probability and random samples and all of that. There's a lot into it, so I would suggest that you become familiar with it, because if you do research, you're going to have to know the principles of sampling, and hopefully this got you off on a good start. Well, that's all we have for today, and we'll start back next week with Chapter 17. Till then, you have a good weekend.